Republican presidential candidate and Yale graduate, Dr. Ben Carson. Dr. Carson, thank you for being here tonight. So how do you see this debate unfolding on these campuses?
Well, that's just the problem. It's not a debate. And that's what needs to happen. The two sides need to sit down and have an open discussion. It's part of the problem that's going on in our country right now. We have people who get in their respective corners and demonize each other, but there's no conversation. And of course, if you ask people to put on the record what their gripes are and what their solutions are, then perhaps they can see that maybe they're not so far apart and they can come up with some reasonable solutions. But, you know, this is just raw emotion and people being manipulated, I think, in many of these cases by outside forces who wish to create disturbances.
Well, what do you make of these students who are with the dean of Yale saying, you can't wear offensive Halloween costumes? Offensive in the mind of whom? Who's to decide what's to, I mean, anything could be potentially offensive. And so the message was, just don't do it. And one professor tries to say, you know what? Some offense, you might have to learn to live with it. That just may be a reality. And you saw the student yelling in his face, the anger she had at his message of, sometimes you might have to accept that not everything is going to be totally okay with you.
Well, we need to recognize that this is a very dangerous trend. When we get to a point where a majority can say, I don't like what you're doing, that's offensive, and therefore I have a right to be violent toward you or to deprive you of rights because I don't like what you're doing. You know, that really goes against the grain of our constitutional rights. And if we don't see that, we're in really big trouble right now.
What do you make of, you grew up, you know, a sort of hard scrabble background, and you had a mother who told you, you know, tough. You're going to have to read more, and you're going to have to get better, and you get yourself out of here with a good education. What they're telling these students right now on the Missouri campus is, if you hear speech that you find insulting, call the cops. You are now supposed to call the campus cops if you hear something offensive. What are we doing to tomorrow's generation?
Well, we're being a little bit too tolerant, I guess you might say, accepting infantile behavior. And I don't care which side it comes from. You know, to say that I have the right to violate your civil rights because you're offending me is un-American. It is unconstitutional. And the officials at these places must recognize that and have the moral courage to stand up to it, because if they don't, it will grow, it will exacerbate the situation, and we will move much further toward anarchy than anybody can imagine, and much more quickly. We simply can't allow those kinds of things to happen, and we must encourage open dialogue. You know, it's the same thing that happens before people get divorced. They stop talking. The next thing you know, their spouse is the devil incarnate. That's what's going on, and we cannot allow that in America.
You can't. You saw that one professor who said, you know what, if you want to offend somebody on Halloween, you know, that's life. And you saw the student, this is at your alma mater, you know, shouting in his face, who the you-know-what put you in this position. She called him master, by the way, because he's master of sort of the student house in which they are. That's the term they use there.
Right.
But you went to Yale, and I mean, was it like this when you were there? Was there this little tolerance for something that might potentially offend?
No, not at all. This is something that's starting to develop now. And you know, I know the president of Yale, and he's a very, very reasonable person. And, you know, I would imagine that he is working overtime right now to try to establish some dialogue and get
he's the one who didn't want the Halloween costumes to go out if they were potentially offensive, which was basically banned 90% of Halloween costumes. All right, let me ask you this. So speaking of your time at Yale, as everybody knows, there was some dust up last week about whether some stories you told in your memoir were true, whether they all checked out. And one of them was of your time at Yale. They decided to play some trick, which was really actually quite jerky. And they told the students in this one class, including you, that your final exams had been burned. You had to show up the next day, retake the exam. You did it. You said in your memoir it was much tougher. Most of the students walked out except for you. And then at the end, despite how ridiculously hard the exam was, you were still there, and a professor came over, gave you $10, and said you're the last honest man. You said the student newspaper took your picture. Then some newspapers did some digging and said they didn't believe it happened. And Wall Street Journal, I think, was the one that investigated that, saying didn't find your picture in the paper, didn't find a course by the name of Perceptions 301, which is how you styled it in your book. And couldn't find a professor or student to verify your account. You wound up producing a newspaper article from the time that backed you up. Another witness has come forward as the guy who said, I actually organized the whole prank. It happened as Dr. Carson said. Nonetheless, some of the details were wrong. There was no class called Perceptions 301. It didn't happen on the date you said. It would have happened in your freshman year, not your junior year. Now, can you understand why some have raised questions, given that even though these stories may have checked out ultimately, they had factual inaccuracies in them, and that does send the spidey senses up for a lot of reporters.
Well, you know, the fact of the matter is I defy you to find anybody who can go back and very accurately detail everything that happened, you know, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. You can give the general flavor, and that's what I did working with a co-writer. And, you know, you're never going to have the exact details in that kind of situation.
But then why fill them in?
But
why not just sort of say, in some class I took in college? You know, that book was written 25 years ago. I don't remember what the conversation was with the co-writer at that time. I remember that we had the class, and I told him about the class, and I told him what happened. And it's been verified that that happened. Mm-hmm. But, you know, having every small detail, I don't think it's actually even reasonable. If somebody has all the details and they remember to that specificity, that would make me actually suspicious. Mm-hmm. Last question before I go. How do you think you did at the debate last night?
I was actually much happier with the debate last night, particularly having the 90-second format where you can actually, you know, get a reasonable thought across to people. Mm-hmm. So I was very happy with the way it worked out.
Thank you for being here tonight, sir.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.